Hi everybody, welcome to your drafting lecture. Today we're going to talk about drafting as an overall language and not necessarily just a particular set of rules. So let's go ahead and dive in. One of the things we want to know before we start is why is it so important? Drafting is super important for a bunch of different reasons. For you, as a scenic designer, it is there for finishing the design. And to be honest, this is no matter what kind of designer you are, whether you're scenic or lighting or sound, if you're doing drafting of any kind, you're finishing those details and making your final choices that convey to somebody what your design is. It also allows you to have full understanding of every side, every angle, and every dimension of the piece that you're thinking about. Sometimes we don't realize until we turn it around and have to design the back side whether or not we want shelves inside of that island in the kitchen, or whether or not we want a piece of the thickness of the wall. We can't always tell what we're going to need until we think about if we need it. So it allows us to take a second and turn over every different piece of the set or every lighting instrument that we're putting in place or everything that we're doing and fully understand why we're making that choice. So what questions are we answering with the drafting overall? We're answering, how will this whole thing fit together on the whole stage? How will this work from the beginning to the end of the play? How big will it be? We need scale. It's all good to pencil sketch something together, but if you don't know whether a chair is a 3-foot regular sized chair or a 45-foot novelty chair, then you don't really know how big something is. We also want to know how much space is there here, meaning how much space is there to walk through, how much space is there to have action, how much space is there to store scenery, how much space is there to have people move around. As a lighting designer, you can understand how movement is going to happen through your space, and it also will allow you to break down how much light you have available from each position to each position on stage. And you're going to need to know where people are going to be to do that. It also helps us understand how things will fit together. If you have moving parts, if something is in the wings or something is moving around, then you're going to have access in the drafting to the entire plan of how the show will move and be figured out. For other people, it's to communicate all that information to the rest of the team. Designers, directors, technical directors, and stage managers all have different levels in which they read drafting. But it is the common language that we use to communicate three-dimensional things in two-dimensional space. Forcing everyone together in order to have everybody understand this is the right way to say a door helps us all understand when we look at that drawing to quickly understand what a door is, but not just what a door means. To the other designers in the room, it helps us understand where pathways will be. To the director, it helps them know where their entrances and exits will be. To the technical director, it helps them understand which flats need to be which size and which standard door they're going to be using, or is it a specialty door? For a stage manager, it helps them to understand how the actors are going to move through that space, and they can help communicate with them, as well as be able to spot discrepancies. So if the director is having them open the door in a very specific way and they know how to read drafting and they can see the designer's drafting and say, oh, the door is not being built to open in that direction, they can correct that problem. Or not correct it, but bring it to everybody's attention. Okay, so drafting, drawings, plans, blueprints, plates, these are all kind of interchangeable names for the thing that we're talking about here. Plates usually refer to each individual piece of paper. Blueprints is the old-timey version of referring to drawings. Plans is often just a shortened version, more used in construction than it is in theater. And then drafting or drawings are often used to convey this understanding. It's all the product and the process of producing this codified representation of three-dimensional construction in two-dimensional space. That's just a very fancy way to say this is the standard language of pictures on paper used to create things and stuff. So who does what with the what now? So a designer creates drafting, whether that's a scenic designer, a lighting designer, a props designer. Lots of people make drafting. Sometimes it is assistant designers or sometimes someone who's doing one particular project. They're going to make drafting all the way through. But then who gets that drafting? Pretty much everybody. And everyone should have access to all of your drafting. And you want them to have access to a PDF, the finished drawing, not necessarily your Vectorworks file or your AutoCAD file or your SketchUp file, because you want to control how they see your stuff all the way through. They can have some of those things as supplemental information, but you always also need to provide the printed version or the PDF version of your drafting so they get a whole idea of that picture. So a technical director will take those drawings to know what you want it to look like. A stage manager needs to have it in rehearsal. A props person will need to be building some of those things as props. A chart artist will use it to calculate square footage, to figure out how big the scenery is, how it goes together so they know which edges to paint which color. The director uses the ground plan to plan the blocking of a show. The lighting designer uses both the ground plan and the section in order to have an intersection of exactly where all the scenery is and exactly how high it is. And the sound designer is going to use a ground plan to know where sound is going to bounce in a room, how things are going to be working in interaction with your set design, as well as looking at where they're going to be able to do speaker placement. Technical drawings are still drafting, but they're a different kind of thing. They're created by the technical director, the master carpenter, or draftsman, but could also be created by a props master. Usually, technical drawings are not seen or approved by the designer, meaning designers' drawings still need to be referenced by all these parties. Prop drafting is similar to technical drawings, just for specific props. And so they could be extremely complicated or look more like costume drawings if you're dealing with puppetry. Prop drafting could also be made by the scenic designer or assistant designer, depending on the show and depending on the staffing and situation. So you mean not all drafting is the same? No, it's not. Drafting, just like any other piece of paperwork, is meant to do a very specific purpose. It's meant to communicate a very specific thing. The same way that if you are creating an email and sending it to your mom, it's going to have a very different look than if you're creating an email and sending it to a friend or a teacher, right? So your technical drawings are detailed images of construction, each using specifying support and the material in which it's made of. And every piece is drafted and noted for duplication, kind of wanting to make sure you know how to precisely build something. While designer drawings are about details and looks. They're not specific on the structure or how you build that in detail unless it's important to the outer look. And many of those things, if it's not visible or not part of the pretty part, are up to the technical director's discretion to change. Sometimes designers' drawings are incomplete with messages to duplicate or copy or replicate the same piece over and over. This is a good example of that. At that centerline section, there's a note that says, this is mirrored on both sides. It's just the same. So go ahead and create both sides of this the same. And so it's a perfectly mirrored piece across the center line. The drafting itself is really focused on the decorative elements. It's focused on the recesses and decorative pieces and how each one of those stack on top of each other. And it is up to the technical director how some of these pieces will be supported or how they come about. So for instance, anything behind this little piece right here, although there's a decorative piece here, this is an inset circle in the wall, and you can see the inset right here. But some of that is specified with the depth and the width of that back area there. But most of that is unseen is left up to the discretion of the technical director on how they're going to put that together. Technical drawings tend to look a little bit more like construction drawings, where they're going to have front views and top views, but they're usually going to have the skin either removed or, in this case, outlined in red, and all of the dimensions that you might need to cut each of these individual pieces, as well as cut lists included. Prop drafting, because it is often smaller items, it's going to be things like chairs or tables or more prop related things that you might be building. And these could look more like technical drawings or could look more like artistic drawings, or you could have both involved, like I do in this case. But any way you slice it, you need to have accurate sizing information. You need to have a good appearance. And you need to make sure you're showing all views of the piece to help someone understand what this thing looks like. Okay, so now that we know why it's important, what do I mean by this as a language? So all of us look at this and understand the same thing. And so that makes it a language, right? We agree that one thing means something, and so we all agree. So if I tell you that my favorite color is purple, and this is what that color looks like, we all agree to call that purple, right? And that's part of what language is. It's just an agreement. So vocabulary is kind of how I look at the individual objects and the individual views, all the little words and parts. So when you're looking at one piece at a time, you can articulate one item in one moment. And grammar is kind of how sentences make sense together. So that is, in drafting, how we convey the conventions of understanding. So line weight help us to understand so that all of the lines don't become this gobbledygook. We arrange things in a particular way to help people better digest the two-dimensional into the three-dimensional form. And that is specific to drafting. We use title blocks in the right place to tell us the right information at the right time, and labeling to connect pieces together. So because of this, we assume that we see what we need and not what we don't need. So that way that we work through drafting means that when we're looking at physical drafted pieces, we're assuming that all of the information we need is right there. And if something is left out, it's because we don't need to know, and we can assume that it's the same. And then when you start putting sentences and those types of things together into long paragraphs or full pages, how they work together to tell a story, they have to flow into one another and be related to one another and go in a logical order, is how we kind of arrange our packet. So when we put all of those separate pages or plates together into one big book of drafting, we're kind of thinking about it as a story that we're telling. That story has some specific rules, but just like an essay is, you have an introduction and then a middle and then an end, we are making a whole packet that tells a story. So what does that story kind of look like? Well, that story have all the drawings in it. So that packet has all of the things. Theatrical drafting conventions asks us to have the following: a ground plan of the whole set, a centerline section of the whole set, and elevations of each individual piece. So what are these things? A ground plan is the whole set in the whole space, including offstage or storage that's around for all of the materials that you're going to be using in the show, including masking and furniture. It's an overall picture of what's happening. So that kind of top view is what we're doing of the whole stage. It's also sometimes thought of as like a footprint or a floor plan, and we'll get into more detail about what that means later, but this is a required overall big view. The centerline section is also an overall big view with the whole set, the whole space, masking and furniture, and a person for reference so that we understand size as soon as we look at this piece. Including a 6-foot person in every plate that it makes sense to in every vertical description helps us to understand if that door is immediately person-sized or if it's a lot bigger than what we think it is. And that's scale. That centerline section is kind of the idea of the side of the set. It is through the middle. So I think of it like a big cake. And then you slice down the center of that cake and split it open, and you're looking through at that center point. And that gives you an idea of exactly how tall the cake is, but also if there's a dowel rod in the middle of the cake, or if the center of the cake is interestingly cut into pieces. The last thing you need is elevations. An elevation is the detail of each individual unit. And just like the whole idea of the set, we actually break down each unit into a plan view, a section or side view, and a front view. And so these things are all straightened and lined up neatly so that we can view them all together and then look to make them. Each page in this packet is called a plate, and the pages are connected through labels. So we label every flat or every unit a different letter, and that way the letter on the ground plan is referenced, the letter on every elevation is referenced, and it helps us to move through this document and know if we're looking at an elevation of an object that is pulled out of context, we can always go back to the ground plan and understand what it looks like in context. So drawing and labeling conventions are norms that increase and communicate understanding. And sometimes you have to make those up. Just like all the other rules we've been talking about in Introduction to Design or Scenic Design, the rules are there in order to increase communication. So if you have to make up a piece of paperwork that works for you, drawing is no different. It doesn't matter whether you're just doing one thing or you're doing a ton of things. If you don't have a good way to describe something in drafting, you're going to have to make it up because what you're doing might be very unusual and you don't know how to draft it. So you're going to fall back on the conventions that we talk about here to draft anything. So in making that, what do all the plates of drawings have? Well, they have objects or things on the page. It's the thing we're drafting. It's the thing we're drawing. They also all have title blocks and borders. If one page gets separated from this packet, we want to make sure we know where it is, if it's outdated information, who drafted it, who is building it, who's involved with the show. All of those things are super important and serves as a label in the corner of each and individual plate. And by numbering them, you can put them back in the correct order into the packet. Every page also includes lines of different weights. The different weights helps you to make something more readable. The same way that when you're reading a sentence, you can either have all lowercase letters, all uppercase letters, or what they call sentence case, which is what you're seeing here. Capital letter in the first word, and then lowercase for everything else. That's a convention that helps us to read these things easier. So line weight is about differentiating things so that they're more apparent. Dimensions give you specific size information. Notes are there to give you any additional information that isn't apparent from the visual that you're getting. And labels help you either to label the whole page or to navigate between pages, knowing where things are. And one of the most important parts of having drafting at all is that every piece on every drafting plate is in scale. They don't all have to be in the same scale on every plate. That's one of the things that's noted in the title block or noted next to a piece if you have multiple scales on a single plate. But everything has to be in scale. That's the whole point, is getting the exact size and shape and makeup of something. Okay, so now that we've talked about why drafting is important and what it's really used for, we can talk about how to do the drafting.